Hello, I'm Alex and welcome to the History Chronicles. If you like our work, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel in return for exclusive perks, please visit our Patreon page. Now, on with the video. Who were the Druids? Where did they come from? What did they believe? Let's find out in today's episode of the History Chronicles. Today's History Chronicle begins in the year 60 AD. Roman general Gaius Suetonius Paullinus is leading an army of legionaries across the Menai Strait to a small island called Mona, now modern Anglesey off the coast of northern Wales. Having constructed a flotilla of boats, Paullinus and his men sailed to the island to put an end to a revolt in the province, and as the Roman historian Tacitus would write later on, the general and his legionaries were met by a large resistance of Britons with weapons at the ready. Women ran about in robes carrying torches. A band of holy men known as Druids were seen raising their heads to the sky, arms outstretched, and placing curses on the Roman invaders. To the Hardened Legionaries, this grand spectacle of defiance from the warriors and the unnerving chanting of their priests was more than enough to send a chill down the spines of the most fearless of warriors. But as the Romans met the full fury of the British warriors, the legionaries, fueled by the words of their general, stood behind their standards and hacked through the British defence. When the battle had been won and the resistors vanquished, the Romans went about the task of destroying the sacred groves that the Druids had created to make offerings to their gods, thus vanquishing the power that these priests would have had on the island. This story is not so much about General Paullinus, but more about the mysterious order of Druids, such as the ones that had served the islanders of Mona prior to the destruction of their order. Just who were the Druids? Where did they come from? What did they believe? How did they worship? These mysterious holy orders have been a focal point of fascination amongst scholars and have been a source of inspiration in pop culture and fiction. The wizened, cloaked figure of the Druid evokes a sense of mystery and magic to present-day audiences. To this day, the story of the Druids is shrouded mostly in myth and legend, with only a small amount of written material from classical writers. The Druids themselves left very little behind in terms of their beliefs and practices. What can be said about the Druids is based on the many writings of Roman and Greek historians, and what the Druids themselves have left behind. When the practice of Druidism first started is unknown, although the earliest references to Druids in history dates back at least 2,400 years ago. Ancient writers such as senator and military general Gaius Julius Caesar would comment on them during his campaign in Gaul, along with classical writers such as Diodorus Siculus and Strabo. The origin of the word Druid has been debated among scholars for many years. According to Pliny the Elder's book, The Natural History, the historian argued that the word derived from the Greek word oak, and it is important to know that the oak tree itself held a large significance in the identity of the Druids and their spiritual beliefs. In the writings of Pliny the Elder, the Druids venerated the mistletoe, along with the tree that it grew from, the oak. This tree would be selected to form the sacred groves for collecting the mistletoe for rites and rituals. This connection with the oak tree can be traced back to previous generations during the prehistoric age. Etymologists claim that the word druid originates from the root words dru-wid, meaning oak knowledge. This would make sense, bearing in mind the relationship that the Druids had with the oak tree. The Greek philosopher and historian Strabo would write that the Druid was one of three important members of Celtic society, the other two being the bard, the poets and singers, and the vates, natural philosophers and diviners. According to Strabo, the Druids served tribal society as judges, providing judgment in all matters, both private and public, and studied natural and moral philosophy. Whether over land disputes, inheritance, or accusations of murder, the Druids served as judge, jury, and executioner. Anyone who questioned their verdict would risk being excommunicated from all religious life, and anyone who had been given this fateful punishment would face being shunned by their own community. The power of Druids could prevent wars from being waged between tribes, which would suggest that they might have been politically involved in matters of state, being able to keep the peace between tribes to find a more peaceful outcome. Diodorus Siculus would write that the Druids would go so far as to step onto battlefields to stand between two armies, preventing them from fighting, and the warriors would have no choice but to obey or suffer the wrath of these highly respected figures. But despite their judicial duties to their tribes, the The Druids were often sought after as educators, known far and wide for their wisdom and knowledge in both the spiritual and the mundane. Parents and guardians would send their children to join the priesthood in order to become a part of the religious order, and it is here that many Celtic individuals learned of the written word, particularly the Greek alphabet. When it came to the Druidic faith, young students were taught to never write anything involving the beliefs and ritualistic practices that they studied, as the Druids did not want their doctrine to be published for the public to view, and it was expected that the students should exercise their memory regarding religious doctrine without relying on the written word. The Druids, like any religious order, fell under a hierarchy, with the highest of the order being the Archdruid, who had supreme powers over the assembly. And if the Archdruid should pass on, there would be a gathering where all Druids would elect a new successor to the position, though on occasion the position was won through violence. While the popular belief that the cult of Druidism was predominantly male, there are suggestions that there might have been females involved in the religious order, as writers like Strabo briefly mention priestesses of the Cimbri, who were reported to have ceremonially killed prisoners of war and would use the victims' blood or entrails to read prophecies of victories and would beat drums during battles. Badges of office and other artifacts made them stand out from the rest of secular society, which included headdresses, wands, scepters, diadems, crowns, and musical instruments. The spiritual and religious life of the Druids are mostly shrouded in mystery, but some information can be gleaned from time to time in ancient sources, due to the fact that the Druids kept a monopoly on their religious doctrine. The spiritual world of the Celts revolved around the rural landscape. Everything had some sort of religious significance, such as lakes, rivers, streams, trees, and animals, all of which had a part in the divine powers of the gods. Sacred springs were widespread throughout Europe, with certain gods and spirits attached to them. Lakes and bogs have also shown evidence of being places of worship. Ritual shafts or wells existed throughout Celtic Europe, the majority of them dating back to the later stages of the Iron Age. The ritual shaft found in Feldbach-Schmiden, Germany, being the most well preserved, containing timber lining that was cut from 123 BC, along with wooden carvings of animals and pottery vessels. Like many in the ancient world, the Druids were polytheists, worshipping a large pantheon of gods. They had sacred rituals and made sacrifices to honour and appease the gods. They also believed in an afterlife. The Druids and the Celts placed an emphasis on the life-giving power of the sun and water. The worshipping of the sun has its links to the Bronze Age period, as Indo-Europeans used the motif of the sun wheel to represent this life-giving force. There were many kinds of gods that the Druids and Celtic tribes worshipped, either due to the popularity in certain distinct regions, or because they were linked to a certain locality. While many gods would have been worshipped, the local population would have a god or goddess that they would show more reverence to, and in some instances, there are cases where there is a triple or triad aspect to the gods, mostly seen in female deities, the most common among them being the Dei Matres, or the Three Mother Goddess, seen in both Roman British and Gallo-Roman culture, demonstrating strength, power, and fertility. The number of gods that the Druids worshipped is speculative, although some scholars estimate it at around 200. Julius Caesar in his commentaries on the Gallic tribes described them as extremely devout to their gods, and that they would go so far as to make human sacrifices over animal ones. The commentaries made by classical writers note some of the ceremonies performed by the Druids, although they tend to focus on the barbarity enacted on behalf of the priests. The type of violence differs, from ritualistic stabbing to shooting with arrows and impalement, or in some cases, having victims burned alive in large wooden structures. It is undetermined whether there was a specific sacrifice for a certain ritual, although it has been speculated that various modes of execution may reflect the invocation of a different kind of deity or ceremony. Apart from appeasing their gods, the Druids took part in these ceremonies alongside seers, known as Vates, who would help in foretelling the future. Divining was not just limited to human sacrifices, but also towards finding omens in the flight and call of birds and the slaughtering of animals, as they believed that all things carry some divine meaning. There are also instances of Druids making predictions of the future through astronomical observations. The Druids were referred to as philosophers throughout ancient texts, which places them in an exalted position on all matters both natural and spiritual. Their thoughts on the human soul and the universe are said to have been indestructible. One might suggest that they believed in the idea of reincarnation, and it has been debated whether the Druids created this belief or if it had been influenced from the works of Pythagoras. The Druids were much more than the priests of barbarian tribes that certain commentators have described them as. Pomponius Mela would describe them as magistri sapienti, or masters of wisdom. Many other classical writers would comment about them as being scholars of high intellect due to their interests in the study of natural science, particularly astronomy. Caesar also commented that the Druids would hold lectures with their students on astronomy, while Pomponius Mela wrote that they knew much about the size and shape of the world, the movement of the heavens, and of the stars. While Hippolytus comments that the Druids foretold certain events through Pythagorean calculations and reckoning, it is possible that the Druids may have been exposed to Greek astronomy and astrology due to the presence of Greeks living in southern Gaul in the 7th century BC. It is probable that the Druids used calendars, such as the Coligny calendar, to aid them in plotting predictions based on astronomical observations. The words Mat and Annum have been seen next to each month of the Celtic year, Mat meaning good and Annum meaning bad. Scholars have concluded that Druids would use the calendar to predict what the best and worst times for the community to take on certain activities such as harvesting, sowing, war, marriage, and so on. While being respected for their intellectualism, Druids were also feared for their supposed use of magic. The Druids were said to have the ability to shapeshift into creatures or other people, cast a magical fog, turn themselves invisible, and in some cases, put people to sleep. By the time the Church became a strong presence in Europe, the power of the saints and the Church in literature became stronger than the pagan priests and their magic, symbolizing the destruction of paganism and the new power of Christianity. With the passage of time, the spread of Christianity diminished the role of the Druid, forcing them to shift to a new role within Christian society. Since the term Druid was associated with paganism and magic, up until the 17th century in Ireland, the wisdom passed down over the centuries in families created hereditary doctors, judges, and bards. But around the mid-14th century, a new resurgence in ancient literature began to circulate throughout Europe, and interest in the Druids began to emerge. English antiquarian John Aubry was an influential writer and scholar in 17th century Britain, who, like many others, associated the Druids with the megalithic monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury, and went so far as to make an archaeological survey on both megalithic sites. He would write his book Monumenta Britannica in the 1670s, a work that would not be published until the 1980s. Aubry would go on to argue that the sites were temples built by the Druids, despite the fact that Stonehenge was built thousands of years before the Druids came into being, although it would have been used by the Druids for their practices later on. By the 18th century, the modern romantic image of the Druid went from custodians of a blood-soaked pagan religion to being closer to the Christian faith, as the Reverend Henry Rowlands would first suggest in his book Mona Antiqua Restaurata in 1723 that they were descendants of Noah, washing away the pagan image and turning them into Old Testament figures. By the mid-18th century, the Druid and nature religion became an appealing image to many writers, artists, and intellectuals. The Druid had now become the wise sage, dispensing wisdom in his sacred grove. The Druids and the mystical life that they led would captivate Westerners with the New Age movement emerging in the 1960s, whilst the tradition of the Druid continues to this day in a different way, riding on the coattails of neo-pagan philosophies, focusing on sacred sites and venerating and protecting nature. While beliefs differ between pagan and Christian, both are committed to preserving Earth. To this day, the Druids remain steeped in mystery, and although we know fragments about them, who they really were, along with their practices and beliefs, will always ignite a fire in the modern human soul, as they lived in a time when mankind worked and lived alongside nature, and held it in infinite respect and awe, which we would do well to remember, and perhaps emulate. You have been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to know what you think of the Druids. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you would like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the History Chronicles.